What if the most feared man in Chicago could be saved by the smallest heartbeat in the world? He ruled with fear until a little girl reminded him what it meant to live. 3 weeks of silence. The world had given up on him, but one mother refused to let him go. Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It is the kind of truth that cracks you open, the kind that reminds you what human beings are capable of when the world has stripped everything else away. His name was Damon Cross. 3 syllables, enough to make grown men lower their voices in dark rooms, enough to make powerful people on 2 continents suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be, enough to silence entire conversations when whispered in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong hour. Damon Cross was 42 years old. He stood 6'3" in bare feet. He had a jaw carved from stone, eyes the color of deep ocean water, and a stillness about him that the underworld had learned to read as a warning rather than a welcome. He wore no flashy jewelry, no expensive watch, no visible sign of wealth. He didn't need those things. Wealth was quiet. Power was quieter still, and Damon Cross was the quietest man in any room he entered. They called him the Ice King. Not because he was cold, though he could be. Not because he was cruel, though he had been. But because when Damon Cross looked at you, really looked at you, the temperature dropped. He had built his empire not with violence first, but with calculation. With the ability to read people faster than they could lie to him. With the rare and terrifying gift of knowing before a word was spoken, exactly where the fault lines ran in every alliance, every loyalty, every human soul across the table from him. From the docks of New Orleans, he had grown a network that reached the back rooms of Chicago, the private clubs of Miami, the shipping containers of Marseille, the boardrooms of Hong Kong. Not through luck, not through birth, through relentless, brutal, elegant intelligence. He had started with nothing, a boy from the Ninth Ward, barefoot in a hallway while his mother worked 3 jobs and his father existed only as an absence shaped like a wound. He had turned that wound into a weapon. He had turned the weapon into an empire. And now he was lying in a hospital bed. 3 bullets, fired at close range in the parking garage of the Meridian Hotel, downtown Chicago, on a Tuesday night in November. 3 bullets from a man he had trusted. The betrayal had shocked the underworld not because it happened, betrayal always happens, but because anyone had actually managed to land the shot. Damon Cross, who had survived a decade of attempts, who had outlasted rivals, enemies, and federal investigations, had finally been brought low. That was 22 days ago. For 22 days, the machines in room 607 had done the breathing for him. The best neurologists in Illinois had reviewed his scans, pursed their lips, and spoken quietly in the corridor with their eyes cast downward. The words they used were minimal responsiveness, prolonged comatose state, and with the particular cruelty of medical language, poor prognosis. Translation: Damon Cross was gone. The empire would need a new king. Outside room 607, the vultures had already begun to circle. His former lieutenants gathered in safe houses across 3 states. His rivals held emergency meetings in penthouse suites. Legal teams drafted documents. Power structures shifted like tectonic plates in the dark. No one came to his bedside for love. No one came for hope. No one came for the man. But one woman, one ordinary, invisible, exhausted woman, pushed her cleaning cart down the corridor of the 6th floor every night and paused at the door of room 607. And she saw something in that motionless figure that none of the doctors, lieutenants, or enemies had been able to see. She saw a human being. And she refused, with the particular stubbornness of the people the world has always overlooked, to let that human being disappear. To understand the miracle, you first have to understand the man. Damon Cross was born on a Tuesday morning in August, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Desire Street in New Orleans' 9th Ward, during a thunderstorm that knocked out the power for 6 hours. His mother, Rosalie, delivered him by candlelight with only a neighbor and a midwife present. His father was not there. His father was never there. Rosalie Cross was the kind of woman who held the world together with sheer refusal. She worked days at a laundry, evenings at a diner, and some nights at a hotel, folding linens in the basement where the fluorescent lights hummed like something dying. She never complained. She never explained. She just worked. And young Damon, watching her from the time he could first form real memories, understood something about the world that most children take decades to learn. No one is coming to save you. The only cavalry is the one you build yourself. He was brilliant, the kind of brilliant that doesn't always look like brilliance from the outside, because it never gets the right opportunity. Teachers noticed it. One, a man named Mr. Fontaine, pulled Damon aside in 7th grade and told him quietly that he had the kind of mind that could change things if he chose to. Damon had nodded politely, walked home that afternoon past 3 corners controlled by 3 different crews, and understood that what Mr. Fontaine was offering was a different kind of life, but not a safer one. Not for someone who looked like him, came from where he came from, had the last name he had. He chose a different path. Not out of nihilism, not out of a lack of imagination. He chose it with the same cold intelligence he would carry for the rest of his life, because he looked at the board and calculated the odds, and decided that the most honest game was the one no one admitted was being played. He started small, running information, a message here, a package there. He had a gift, the same gift that would eventually make him legendary, for reading rooms, for knowing who wanted what and what they were willing to pay. By 16, he was brokering deals between crews that had spent years in open conflict, not because he convinced them to make peace, but because he understood that the profit margin on war was always negative, and he could show people that in numbers. By 23, he had his first real operation, a logistics network along the Gulf Coast that looked, on paper, like a small shipping and storage company. It was, in reality, a nerve center connecting suppliers, distributors, and intermediaries across 4 states. He paid his people well. He paid the right officials quietly. He moved product, money, and information with the precision of a Swiss watch. He never touched the street directly. That was always his rule. Strategy, not execution. Mind, not muscle, though he had both. He hired muscle. He hired lawyers and accountants and former intelligence analysts who had grown tired of government salaries. He built an architecture of insulation and intelligence that made him nearly untouchable. By 30, he had his first international connections. By 35, he was operating on 3 continents. By 40, the Ice King controlled an empire that law enforcement agencies in 4 countries had spent millions trying to map, and still didn't have fully right. But here is what the legend always missed, what the files and surveillance photos and intelligence reports never captured. Damon Cross was lonely. Spectacularly, profoundly lonely. The kind of lonely that accumulates when everyone around you is either afraid of you, working for you, or trying to use you. The kind of lonely that comes from never being seen as anything but a threat or a resource. The kind of lonely that grows in the silence of a man who built walls so thick to protect himself that he forgot what it felt like to stand on the inside of them with someone else. He had never married. He had no children. He had associates, allies, useful people, and enemies. He had power and money and influence and the terrible freedom of a man who answers to no one. He had nothing that loved him. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he didn't need it. He had built an empire on the principle that need was weakness, and weakness was the beginning of the end. And then 3 bullets found him in a parking garage. And the machines breathed for him. And in the quiet dark of his coma, for the first time in 40 years, Damon Cross had nothing to think about but the emptiness. He couldn't feel his body. He couldn't see. He couldn't move or speak or signal his presence to the world outside. He was consciousness without form, trapped in the silence he had always told himself he wanted. And in that silence, he discovered something devastating. He didn't want it. He was terrified. Not of death, he had made his peace with that years ago. He was terrified of something worse than death, disappearing without having mattered to anyone, without anyone anywhere having truly known him. The empire would survive. The money would find new hands. The power would redistribute itself through a dozen greedy fists. But Damon Cross, the boy from Desire Street, the boy whose mother hummed gospel while she folded other people's laundry, the boy who once stayed up all night reading a library book about the stars because he thought if he could understand how big the universe was, his small life might feel less confining. That person would simply vanish. No trace, no print, no warmth left on the world. And deep in the darkness, that thought terrified him more than anything an enemy had ever done. He couldn't know, lying there in the humming dark, that on the other side of room 607's door, a woman in a gray uniform was pushing a mop bucket down the corridor. A woman who was about to accidentally save his life simply by refusing to see him the way everyone else did. Lena Parker had been invisible for most of her adult life. Not because she was unremarkable. Anyone who spent 5 minutes actually talking to her would tell you the opposite, that she had the kind of warm, sharp, generous intelligence that makes a room feel safer, that she could make you laugh at something painful and mean it kindly, that she remembered things about people, small things, the things most people let fall, and brought them back at exactly the moment you needed them. But the world tends not to notice the people it depends on most, the cleaners, the maintenance workers, the overnight staff who make the infrastructure of daily life function invisibly while everyone else sleeps. Lena Parker was one of those people, and she had learned to move through the world as they all learn to move, quietly, efficiently, with the focused attention of someone who understands that her job is to be useful without being seen. She had grown up in South Side Chicago, the eldest of 4 children, raised by a grandmother named Ida Mee who could stretch $1 into a week and a prayer into a miracle. Her mother had struggled with addiction and disappeared from the picture when Lena was 9. Her father she had never known. But Ida Mee, with her cast-iron skillet and her cast-iron faith, had held the family together, and Lena had grown up watching her and learning, without being taught directly, what it meant to carry people. She had tried college, 2 semesters at a community school before the money ran out, and the practical reality of $400 a month in rent made abstract goals feel like a luxury. She got a job, then another. She moved through the service economy the way people do when they're not making choices so much as responding to necessities. Laundry facilities, then a hotel, then a hospital cleaning service that paid $12 an hour and offered health insurance after 90 days. The hospital was the best of the jobs she'd had. The work was hard and the hours were strange. She took the overnight shift because it paid slightly more, and because her neighbor, Miss Claudette, was retired and willing to watch Emma through the night in exchange for a home-cooked meal 3 times a week. It was an arrangement that worked, in the way that working-class arrangements work, through generosity and necessity braided together, with no room for anything to go wrong. Emma was 3 years old. Emma was the center of everything. If you needed to understand what drove Lena Parker, what made her strong when she had every reason not to be, what made her generous when the world gave her nothing to spare, what made her see the humanity in a comatose crime lord when everyone else had written him off, the answer was Emma. Emma was a small, serious child with enormous dark eyes and a deep, genuine laugh that came up from her whole belly. She had Lena's wide forehead and her father's long gone, not worth discussing, stubborn lower lip. She was fascinated by the moon. She collected interesting rocks from the sidewalk. She had named a pigeon that visited their fire escape Gerald, and she greeted Gerald every morning with the seriousness of a diplomat maintaining an important alliance. Emma had her mother's gift. She saw people. She saw through the surface of things to whatever was underneath, with the particular clarity of very young children who haven't learned yet that looking too closely is considered impolite. Every night before Lena left for her shift, Emma would take her mother's face in her small hands and press their foreheads together. "Be safe," Emma would say, with the gravity of someone much older, And Lena would close her eyes, hold that moment like something sacred, and carry it with her through the empty corridors. Lena had been assigned to the 6th floor for 4 months when they brought Damon Cross in. She hadn't known who he was at first, or rather, she knew the name, the way everyone in the city knew the name, the way you know the names of storms and disasters. She knew what he represented. But the figure in room 607, connected to machines, lying absolutely still in the clinical light, wasn't a king or an empire. He was a man alone in a hospital gown, with no one coming to see him who wasn't calculating the angles of his absence. The first night she cleaned his room, she spoke. It wasn't planned. It wasn't policy. It was just she couldn't stand the silence. She'd cleaned rooms for people too sick or too sedated to respond before, and she always found herself talking to them quietly about nothing important. Not because she thought they could hear, but because it felt wrong to treat a person like a piece of furniture just because they weren't conscious. Because she believed, in the way that Ida Me had taught her to believe things, without needing proof, that some part of a person is always listening. So she talked. She told him about Emma and the pigeon named Gerald. She told him about the best tamale she'd ever eaten at a food truck outside a laundromat on 47th Street. She told him about the way the sky looked just before sunrise when she walked to the bus stop, that particular shade of dark blue that existed for about 4 minutes before it began to change. She told him about hope, not in an abstract way, in the specific, small, practical way that hope actually lives in a life like hers, in a daughter's laugh, in a meal shared with a neighbor, in the moment a long shift ends and you step outside and feel the cold air on your face like a gift. Every night for 3 weeks, Lena pushed her cart to room 607 and talked to the man the world was already mourning. And deep in the darkness, the Ice King listened. He couldn't respond. He couldn't open his eyes or squeeze her hand or signal in any way that her words were reaching him, but they reached him. In whatever state of consciousness he inhabited, that dim, formless territory between life and death, Lena Parker's voice was a light, not a spotlight, not a searchlight, something smaller and steadier, a candle held in cupped hands against the wind. He held on to it. He didn't know who she was. He couldn't have named her or described her face or told you anything about her. He only knew the voice and the warmth in it, and the daughter she loved so much her words changed quality when she spoke about her, deepened, softened, filled with something he had no name for but recognized instinctively as the most real thing he'd encountered in 40 years. He held onto the voice the way a drowning person holds onto anything solid. And he waited. The storm that hit Chicago on the night of December 14th was the kind that erases the line between the sky and the earth. It came in from the lake with the full weight of December behind it. Ice in the rain, wind that leaned against buildings, a howling that found every gap and draft in every old structure, and reminded you just how thin the walls between warmth and cold actually were. Lena had been scheduled to work. She needed to work. There was no option in her life that looked like take the night off. But Emma was sick. The fever had started that afternoon, a slow, crawling warmth that Lena noticed when she picked Emma up from Miss Claudette's and felt the heat radiating through her daughter's thin sweater. By 6 o'clock it was 102. By 7 it was climbing. Emma, who was never a crier, who faced the world with a serious stoicism that made strangers comment on it, was crying in that particular way, breathless, helpless, exhausted, that made something in Lena's chest tighten into a fist. She had children's fever medication. She had 2 doses left in the bottle, enough to get through tonight and tomorrow morning. But that was all. She had $12 in her wallet and $47 in her bank account, and payday wasn't until Friday. She called the clinic. Walk-in hours were over, and the emergency room copay was $200, which might as well have been $2,000. Miss Claudette's phone went to voicemail. Her sister in Indianapolis didn't pick up. The friends she might have called had been lost, gradually, in the particular erosion of a life lived at the edge of capacity. There's never enough energy after everything to maintain the friendships. They just drift. And one day you pick up the phone and realize you don't know who to call. Lena sat on the edge of Emma's small bed and looked at her daughter and felt the particular terror of a parent who realizes that their love, no matter how complete and fierce and all-encompassing, cannot by itself keep a child safe. That loving someone isn't enough. That sometimes the math of survival is just the math of survival, and it doesn't bend for love. She gave Emma the second-to-last dose of fever medicine. She held her until she stopped crying. She sang soft and low, the old songs Ida Me used to sing, the ones that felt like they came from somewhere older than any of them. Emma went still, not asleep but calm. Her hand found Lena's finger and held it. "Mama," Emma said quietly, her voice thick and small, "I'm cold." The heat in the apartment was unreliable. It had been unreliable all month, the building's boiler running at maybe 60%. Lena had extra blankets. She wrapped Emma in 2 of them. She put on her own coat. She made the calculation that she'd been making since Emma was born. What can I give, and what do I have, and how do I make those 2 things match? They didn't match tonight. She couldn't leave Emma alone. She couldn't afford urgent care. She couldn't call in sick without risking her job. And she couldn't, her mind refused absolutely to form the thought all the way through. She couldn't let Emma get worse. She couldn't. Then the idea came. It arrived the way desperate ideas always arrive. Not reasoned, not considered, but sudden and complete, with the particular quiet certainty of a thought that knows it has nowhere else to go. The hospital was warm. The hospital had medicine. The hospital had a room, a private room with a constant temperature and a functioning heating system, where a man lay alone, connected to machines, in more warmth and safety than anyone else on the 6th floor. A man who had no visitors who came for kindness. A man who, for 3 weeks, had received only Lena's voice and Lena's presence. She told herself she would be careful. She told herself it was just for a few hours, just until Emma's fever broke or she could figure out another option. She told herself she would explain, somehow, to whoever needed explaining. She didn't let herself think too carefully about any of this, because thinking too carefully would have stopped her, and she couldn't afford to be stopped. She bundled Emma in the blanket, both blankets, and carried her daughter out into the storm. The bus was nearly empty at that hour. The driver, a wide man with kind eyes who had seen Lena on this route 100 times, looked at Emma and looked at Lena and didn't ask questions. Sometimes the city is kind in small, uncomplicated ways that you remember forever. At the hospital, Lena signed in at the staff entrance. She moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned exactly how to occupy space without drawing attention. Emma was bundled so completely she could have been a package of supplies. Lena kept her against her chest, one hand bracing the small back she knew by heart, every knob of the spine, the particular narrowness of the shoulders, the way Emma tucked her head under her mother's chin even now, even sick, as though that were simply where she belonged. The service elevator to the 6th floor, the quiet corridor, the nursing station at the far end occupied with paperwork and a muted conversation she didn't approach. The guards outside room 607, 2 of them, men Damon's organization had placed there, who looked at Lena and saw only what they always saw, the cleaning woman, invisible, non-threatening, routine. She nodded. She pushed her cart through the door. Inside, room 607 was warm. Warmer than she'd expected, the thermostat must have been set for a patient's needs. The air held at a consistent, sheltered temperature that felt, after the storm and the cold and the bus and the fear, like stepping into something sacred. The machines hummed. The monitors cast a faint blue light, and Damon Cross lay motionless, as he had lain for 22 days, his broad chest rising and falling in the measured rhythm of the ventilator. Lena set Emma down in the chair by the window first. She checked her daughter's temperature with her palm still high but steadier. Emma looked around the room with her enormous, fever-bright eyes, curious despite everything. "Who is that?" Emma whispered, pointing at the bed. "Someone who needs help," Lena said quietly, "like you." Emma considered this. She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when something made sense to her on a level she couldn't fully articulate. Lena stood at the edge of the bed and looked at Damon Cross. She had talked to him every night for weeks. She knew the lines of his face now, the deep set of his eyes, the scar along his jaw, the tattoos that covered his forearms in patterns she'd sometimes studied while she worked, tracing the shapes in her mind. She had never touched him. The cleaning staff worked around the patients, not through them. But Emma was shivering. And the bed was warm. And Damon Cross, the most feared man in America, the Ice King, the man an entire underworld was circling like a territory to be claimed, was simply a large, still, warm presence in a room. A person who, as far as Lena had been able to determine over 3 weeks of careful, quiet attention, had never once had someone be gentle with him in this room. She lifted Emma, careful, and eased her onto the edge of the broad hospital bed. Not on him, just beside him in the warmth. But Emma, in the way of small children with fevers who are exhausted and cold and trusting, shifted. She turned toward the warmth. She pressed herself against the nearest solid, warm thing, the way children and animals do instinctively, without calculation, without fear. She pressed her small chest against Damon's side. And then something happened that no medical text can explain. The monitors changed. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, where everything surges and lights flash and the moment announces itself. It was subtle, a shift in the rhythm, a slight deepening in the brainwave pattern, a change in his heart rate that the machine noted with a faint, persistent change in its steady cadence. Like something waking up. Like a city beginning to remember how to turn its lights back on. Lena stood frozen, watching the screens. She was not a medical professional. She didn't know how to read the readouts with precision. But she had spent weeks listening to those machines, and she knew their normal language, and this was different. This was something she had not heard before. Emma had fallen asleep. Her breathing had deepened and steadied, her fever heat releasing into the warmth beside her, her small hand lying open on the hospital bed like a starfish on a warm rock. And beneath her hand, barely perceptible, almost impossible to be sure of, was that movement. Was that the faintest, almost molecular tremor of a finger trying to respond? Lena didn't move. She barely breathed. She watched. She waited. If this story is moving you, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment with your favorite line so far. The best stories are shared. The end will marvel you, but only if you're here. He came back the way storms end, not all at once but in stages. First, a sound. Not the machines. He had been hearing the machines in some distant, muffled way for days. This was different, small, rhythmic, close. A breathing pattern he didn't recognize, slow and steady and entirely without fear. He turned toward it, not physically, not yet. Internally, with the last functioning navigation system in his darkened mind. He turned toward it like a compass finding north. Then warmth. Actual physical warmth against his left side. Something small and warm and alive pressed against him, and the warmth of it moved through the hospital gown and through the skin beneath it and into whatever part of him was still capable of receiving sensation. It was the warmth of a living creature. It was the warmth of innocence. He would not have been able to explain how he knew that, but he knew it the way you know certain things in the deepest places, beyond language. Then a voice. Not the voice he'd been hearing every night, that warm, steady voice of the woman in the corridor, but related to it. A younger version, a miniature echo. A child's voice, soft with sleep, humming something unrecognizable, a melody without words, the kind of sound a child makes when they feel completely safe. The darkness in Damon Cross had been total for 22 days. Not darkness like sleep. Sleep has texture, has the faint warmth of proximity to consciousness. This was different. This was the darkness of a system fully shut down, a city after a catastrophic power failure. Every light out, every sound gone, the streets empty and the sky without stars. But warmth is, it turns out, its own kind of signal. And innocence, genuine, absolute, unperformed innocence, has a frequency that nothing can block. Something in Damon Cross responded to that frequency. His fingers moved first. Not deliberately, reflexively, instinctively, the oldest parts of his nervous system responding before his conscious mind had any say in the matter. His hand, lying open at his side, turned, slowly, almost imperceptibly, palm up, then fingers curling gently around the small form pressed against him, not gripping, not grabbing, just enclosing. The way hands move toward warmth before the brain has processed the command. On the monitors, everything changed. The neurological activity that had been flatlined for 3 weeks began to pulse. Faint at first, like the first trembling signal from a radio tower coming back online, finding its frequency, testing the distance. Then stronger, then real. Lena saw it before the alarms. She saw his hand move. She saw it close around Emma, and she felt her own heart stop one terrible, suspended second before she understood what she was seeing. Not violence, not the reflexive grip of a man in distress. Something else entirely, something that looked inexplicably like protection. Then the alarms. The nursing station erupted, running feet. The door to room 607 burst open. 2 nurses, a doctor, one of the night residents, all of them stopped in the doorway when they saw it. The man who had been classified as non-responsive for 22 days, holding a small child with both hands, his face contracted in an expression that even the doctors, people trained to observe and categorize, had difficulty numbing. It looked like grief. It looked like relief. It looked like the face of someone surfacing from water so deep they weren't sure, until this moment, which direction was up. "Sir," one of the nurses moved toward the bed. "Sir, can you hear me?" He opened his eyes. Not slowly, not gradually the way people open their eyes in the morning. He opened them as if opening them was an act of will, sharp, sudden, complete. And the eyes that looked out at the room were exactly what people who had dealt with Damon Cross would have described. Deep and still and clear and absolutely aware. He looked at the nurse. He looked at the doctor. He looked at the doorway where the 2 guards from his organization had appeared, their faces cycling through shock and calculation, and something that might have been relief or might have been something more complicated. Then he looked down at the small child pressed against his side, her eyes now open too, looking up at him with the specific unfrightened curiosity of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to be afraid of men who look like this man. Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she pointed at the tattoo on his forearm, the dragon, scales detailed in black and gray, and said with absolute seriousness, "That's a dragon." And Damon Cross, feared across 2 continents, builder of an empire, the Ice King who had spent 22 days in the darkness, felt something break open in his chest. Not painfully. The way a window breaks open on the first real day of spring, sudden and necessary and full of air. His voice, when it came, was a ruin, rough and raw and almost unrecognizable, but it was there. "Yeah," he said, "that's a dragon." The nurses rushed in. The doctor called for a full assessment. The night resident ran back to the station. The room filled with controlled chaos, people doing the work of medicine with the urgency that 22 days of a hopeless case suddenly revering itself demanded. Through all of it, Damon Cross kept his hands around the child. He didn't let go. And no one, not the nurses, not the doctor, not the guards with their guns and their calculations, no one asked him to. Victor Harlan had been planning for this moment for 3 years. He had cultivated the plan the way you cultivate something that needs to grow in darkness, with patience, with silence, with the particular discipline of a man who knows that rushing will get him killed. He had been Damon's right hand for 11 years. He had been trusted completely, which meant he knew everything. Every account, every alliance, every contact, every pressure point. He knew where the bodies were metaphorically and, in a few cases, literally. He had pulled the trigger himself. In the parking garage of the Meridian Hotel, 3 shots close range from a gun that had since been destroyed. He had walked to his car, driven to his apartment, and made himself a meal while Damon Cross was loaded into an ambulance. He had waited. He had planned. He had begun, with surgical care, to position himself. 22 days later, with Damon's prognosis officially listed as persistently comatose, outcome uncertain, Victor Harlan had moved almost everything into place. The key lieutenants were aligned. The international partners had been contacted. The legal structures were being redrawn by lawyers who were good enough not to ask questions and smart enough not to need the answers. He had scheduled the formal consolidation for 48 hours from now. A meeting in a private club, the kind with no cameras and a staff who understood discretion. The kind where new arrangements were made over good whiskey and handshakes that carried the weight of contracts, because breaking them carried consequences worse than any court could impose. The call came at 3:12 in the morning. Victor was awake. He didn't sleep much anymore. Anticipation had that effect on him. He was reading documents at his kitchen table, a glass of water at his right hand, when his phone lit up with a number he recognized as one of his people at the hospital. He picked up. The voice on the other end was controlled, professional, but underneath the control there was something that Victor had almost never heard from this particular person: unsteadiness. "He's awake." Victor was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted them later, recalling the moment. 4 seconds of absolute stillness, during which every calculation he had made over 3 years rearranged itself in his head like a building in an earthquake. The same pieces, suddenly, drastically differently aligned. "Confirmed," he said. Eyes open, speaking. "Full cognition, they think. It happened about an hour ago. The doctors are still running assessments." "Hell." "No one knows. There was a woman cleaning staff. She brought a child in. Something happened. Nobody can explain it." Victor set the phone down on the table for a moment without ending the call. He looked at his hands, steady, as they always were. He had trained his hands to be steady through things that would have made other men shake. He looked at his documents. He thought about the meeting scheduled for 48 hours from now. He thought about the new arrangements. He thought about all the pieces he had so carefully moved into position. He picked the phone back up. "Send 2 men," he said. "Room 607, make it quiet." He ended the call. In room 607, Damon Cross was undergoing a neurological assessment when the shift changed in the energy of the guards outside the door. He noticed it. Not because anyone told him, not because he could see anything beyond the room, but because after 40 years of surviving by reading rooms, he noticed it in the quality of the quiet. The way a trained animal notices the wind change before the storm comes. He looked at Lena, who was sitting in the corner chair with Emma, now mostly asleep in her arms, watching the medical team work with the measured calm of someone who is terrified, but has decided to be terrified quietly. "You need to take her to the other side of the room," he said. Lena looked at him. His voice was still rough, still damaged from weeks of disuse, but the eyes were clear and direct and carried an instruction she somehow understood without further explanation. She moved. The door opened 2 minutes later. 2 men, professional, the type that moved a certain way, economically, purposefully, with the particular controlled purpose of people whose job is to be the last thing someone sees. They wore the clothes of hospital visitors. They were not hospital visitors. They stopped when they saw him. They had expected a comatose man. They had expected a patient. They had received intelligence, until 40 minutes ago accurate intelligence, that the target was non-responsive, that it would be the simplest thing in the world. Instead, they found Damon Cross sitting upright in the hospital bed, IV still attached, monitoring leads still on his chest. He was not trying to stand or fight or call for help. He was simply looking at them, the way he had always looked at people who came to him with problems, with the patience of a man who has already thought 3 moves ahead and decided he isn't worried. He spoke quietly, without raising his voice. What he said was brief. He used no threats explicitly. Threats are for people who need to perform power. He stated facts. He told them what he knew about Victor Harlan's operation, which was everything, because Damon Cross had built that operation. He told them what that information was worth to the organizations Victor was currently negotiating with. He told them what their futures looked like under Victor's arrangement. The specific, researched, accurate futures of men at their level, who are useful until they become problems, and then become problems very quickly. Then he looked at them and let the silence do the rest. They left. They didn't run. Running would have been undignified, and they were professionals. But they walked to the elevator at a pace that suggested they had somewhere else to be, and they did not look back, and they did not answer when Victor's number came up on their phones over the next 30 minutes. In the corner of room 607, Emma woke up briefly, looked at the empty doorway, and then looked at Damon. "The men went away," she observed. "They did," Damon said. "Good," said Emma with finality, and went back to sleep. Lena looked at Damon Cross across the width of the room. He looked back at her, and in that look passed something that neither of them would have been able to put into words: an acknowledgement, an understanding, a mutual recognition that some things had just permanently changed. Recovery for a man like Damon Cross is not a straightforward thing. There is the physical recovery, the weeks of rehabilitation, the slow, sometimes humiliating process of rebuilding strength and mobility in a body that had been still for 3 weeks. He had been in extraordinary physical condition before the shooting. That helped. He progressed faster than his doctors expected. He didn't tell them that he had additional motivation, because explaining motivation to medical professionals in a hospital where armed men had recently stood outside his door was the kind of conversation that created complications. There is the strategic recovery, the careful, methodical work of reasserting his position in an empire that had spent 3 weeks assuming he was dead. Victor Harlan, presented with the reality of Damon's return and the specificity of what Damon now knew and was willing to use, made a quiet exit from the organization. Not a peaceful one in any meaningful sense, but a quiet one, which in this context was the best available option. Others followed. The empire contracted and then stabilized. Some alliances shifted. Some structures changed. The organization Damon returned to was not the same one he had left. He found that he didn't mind. And then there is the other kind of recovery, the kind that doesn't have a clinical name, the kind that happens in the spaces between sleep and waking, between one conversation and the next, in the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that seem small and turn out to be everything. 6 months after the night, Emma pressed her small chest against the side of a comatose crime lord and reminded his body that it had a reason to keep beating. Damon Cross stood in the kitchen of a new apartment and watched Lena Parker make coffee. The apartment was in a building on the north side of the city, not flashy, not a statement. Just a good building on a good block, with working heat and large windows and a landlord who received his rent on time without questions. Damon had arranged it, not as payment, not as a transaction, as the simplest possible expression of a thing he was still learning to do, care for people without framing it as strategy. He had been living 3 floors below them, close enough to be present, far enough to give space, learning the geometry of this new arrangement slowly, the way you learn a language by immersion, by stumbling, by correcting, by trying again. Emma had adapted to the new situation with the alarming ease of the very young, who have not yet learned to assume that good things are temporary. She had, within 2 weeks, claimed Damon as a permanent fixture of her life with the matter-of-fact authority of a child who has decided something is true. She called him by his name, not a title, not a formal address. Just Damon, in the same flat tone she used to address Gerald the pigeon. She had taken a particular interest in his tattoos. She had, over the course of several Sunday afternoons, been given a comprehensive guided tour of every piece on both arms, complete with explanations of each. The dragon she already knew. There was a compass rose that she felt was practical and good. There was a series of names in small print along his left forearm, people, he told her, who deserved to be remembered. She had studied these with great seriousness and told him he should add more names when more people deserved it. He had agreed. He was teaching her to play chess. She was 4 months into it, and she had recently beaten him once, genuinely beaten him, not a courtesy loss. He had not felt prouder of anything in 42 years. Lena watched all of this with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, quiet, steady, genuinely present. She had not from the first moment allowed herself to be either frightened by what Damon was or naive about it. She had asked him, in the direct way she had of asking things that mattered, what he was doing and what he intended. He had answered her honestly. She had not pretended the answers were comfortable. She had sat with them, thought about them, and arrived at her own conclusions. "You're not going to do this forever," she had said one evening. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even entirely a demand. It was a statement delivered with the tone of someone who is telling you something true before you fully admitted it to yourself. He had looked at her for a long time. "No," he'd said, "I'm not." He had begun, quietly and carefully, the long process of extracting himself. Not overnight. That kind of withdrawal done carelessly cost lives, but deliberately, methodically. Closing things, transferring things, stepping back from things in ways that were sustainable and safe. He had lawyers who had spent years helping him build the empire. Now he had lawyers helping him dismantle it, piece by piece, replacing it with things that were clean. It would take years, he knew that. He was honest about it. But he was doing it. Some mornings he woke up in the apartment 3 floors below Lena and Emma and lay in the unfamiliar quiet of an ordinary life and felt the weight of everything he had done. He didn't romanticize it and he didn't excuse it. He let it sit with him, the way honest people let difficult things sit with them. He had caused harm, real harm. He carried that. But he also woke up on those mornings to the sound of Emma's feet on the floor above him, running from her bedroom to the kitchen, in the way she always ran, with complete commitment, like running itself was an experience worth going all out on. He woke up to that sound, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 40 years began, incrementally, to release. This was worth building. This was worth protecting. This was what all the power in the world was supposed to be for and never had been. He made coffee on those mornings. He brought it up 3 floors. Lena would look at him over the rim of her mug. She never wasted words in the morning, which he had come to love. And Emma would come thundering in from wherever she'd been and demand to know if today was a chess day. It was usually a chess day. Those mornings, Damon Cross, the Ice King, the man the underworld had whispered about for decades, felt something he had no previous frame of reference for. Something simple and enormous and entirely ordinary. He felt like he was home. It was Lena who noticed the car first. She didn't say anything about it right away. She had learned in 6 months the difference between the things that were worth saying and the things that were worth watching first. The car was parked on the opposite side of the street, a dark sedan mid-range, the kind of car designed to be unmemorable. It had been there yesterday morning. It was there now. She mentioned it to Damon over dinner, casually, in the way she mentioned things she wanted him to have the information about without alarming Emma. He had gone still, the way he went still when something mattered. "What color?" "Dark green, maybe black. I couldn't tell in the rain." He nodded. He finished his dinner. He helped Emma with the last chapter of the book they were reading together. He said good night in the way he always did, with the particular care of someone who understood that good night might mean something, who had spent enough time without mornings to take them seriously. Then he made 3 phone calls. The information that came back was not good. Victor Harlan had spent 6 months in Europe, quiet, low profile, seemingly accepting the reality of his situation. But 3 weeks ago, something had changed. There were people asking questions. Not his own people, foreign people, representing interests that had never intersected with Damon's directly. People to whom Victor had apparently offered something valuable in exchange for a specific outcome. Damon sat in his apartment with the phone in his hand and understood, with the cold clarity that had always defined him, that the storm was not over. It had simply been gathering. Victor Harlan could accept losing the empire. He was ambitious enough to rebuild. But what Victor Harlan could not accept, what had eaten at him through 6 months of European exile, was that Damon Cross was still alive. That the man he had shot 3 times in a parking garage was sitting in an apartment on the north side of Chicago, teaching chess to a 4-year-old, building something new out of the rubble of the old. That was the wound Victor couldn't close, and wounded men do reckless things. Damon stood up. He crossed to the window. He looked out at the dark sedan on the street below, still there, patient as a threat, and felt something shift inside him. Not fear. Fear was not a thing he carried in the same way anymore. He felt instead the familiar weight of responsibility, the knowledge that the thing you love, once you have something you love, becomes the most vulnerable thing in the world. He had built a life. He had chosen it deliberately, imperfectly, with both eyes open. He would not let anyone take it. But keeping them safe, keeping Emma and Lena and this ordinary, miraculous existence intact against people who had learned that reaching him through money or power no longer worked, would require something he had spent 6 months learning to let go of. He would have to become the thing he had been, one last time, in order to protect the thing he was becoming. Above him, through the ceiling, he heard Emma's footsteps, running to the kitchen, the sound of Lena's voice, warm and low, saying something he couldn't make out but felt the shape of. He closed his eyes. He held that sound. Then he opened them and reached for his phone and began to make the calls. Like, subscribe, comment, I believe below. Part 2 is coming, and the storm that's been building for 6 months is about to break. Victor Harlan hasn't given up. The foreign players he's brought in don't care about history or mercy or anything a man finds when a small child presses her heartbeat against his. They care about outcomes, and the outcome they've been hired to deliver is simple and final. Will Damon Cross survive what's coming? Can a man who has spent a lifetime building walls learn in time to let the people he loves help him defend them? And what happens to Lena and Emma when the world they've built together becomes the thing that draws danger to their door? Stay tuned. If this story found you today, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Someone who needs to be reminded that transformation is real, that people change, that love is stronger than history, that the smallest heartbeat can wake what the world has given up on.